Assalamu alaikum, namaste. This is not something I usually do, but hey, it's Saturday night for us here, and I'm joined by Khalil Andani. And hold on, just want to make sure everything is live. And I think we are on Khalil, you still here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm getting an ad on the thing. It's a Ramadan ad.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know how you've monetized this, but
Give me a sec. Let's give it a second to catch
there.
up.
Now,
All right, alrighty. So, like I said, I'm joined by Khalil, and just to introduce him, I just want to make sure that everything looks fine. Guys, can you actually see the video moving? It looks frozen on my screen. Hold on, let me see. Oh, it is frozen. Okay, hold on. Let me re-add you. Okay, there we go. Alrighty, finally. Okay, technical issues aside, we are live now. Finally. Okay, so guys, if you have any problems hearing me, do let me know if there's any problems with the sound, anything like. Okay, I see. Salam alaikum. So yeah, it's working. There we go. Alrighty. So I'm joined by Khalil Andani. Just to introduce him quickly, Khalil is an academic in the field of Islamic studies. So in his previous life, he was studying mathematics. He has prior degrees in mathematics and accounting, and now has a master's in theological studies from the Harvard Divinity School. He's currently an advanced PhD candidate in Islamic Studies at Harvard. Well, it's a mouthful. Specializing in Quranic Studies, the intellectual history of Islamic philosophy, and Ismailism. I've invited him to discuss several topics related to this nature, so it's going to be an interesting discussion. We're looking to discuss academic study of Islam, the history of the Quran, and the internal diversity of Islam to history. So there's quite a lot there. I have a feeling we may not actually get through all of it, but yeah. Well, let's give it a try. And if you're new here, my name is Abdullah Samir. I'm an ex-Muslim. Interestingly, ex-Sunni Muslim. I was born as Ismaili, but I converted to Sunni. So for all intents and purposes, I'm an ex-Sunni Muslim, and I'm now atheist. So let's just get into it. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. And Khalil, how's it going?
good. Nice evening today. Nice to be with you and everyone else tuned in.
Awesome. So let's just talk about how you got into Islamic studies. So your background was accounting, mathematics. How did you end up transitioning into Islamic studies? How did that happen, and what happened there?
Yeah, so that's always a funny story. Well, I don't know if it's funny, but it's always a story. I grew up in a South Asian family, an Ismaili Muslim family, and like most South Asian kids, we're often given the option of career choices that's very restricted. You can be a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, an engineer. I'm sure you got the same thing. And it just never, I didn't even know what the academic study of religion even was. But I was always interested in religion as a kid. I think in first grade, I did like a voluntary project on comparative religion
Oh wow.
at a very sort of, elementary childish level. But at that point, I thought I was seeing patterns in different religions. So it just fascinated me personally. And as I grew up, I studied to be an accountant, and that's what I did. But I was always reading about religion and Islamic studies on the side. So I was reading academic books throughout high school, throughout undergrad. And I found it much more interesting personally to learn about Islam and other faith traditions through scholarly academic publications. So probably like many people, whether Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, I didn't find sort of the religious education in my community to be very intellectually stimulating. So I thought there was sort of much more to meet the eye, and I always made it a point to sort of read academic, scholarly publications, books written by professors, and so on. And I fell in love with the subject and the methodology, and I made a decision. I think it was 6 years ago now. 6 years ago. I decided to full out switch and apply, go back to grammar school, accept study with passion.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, I can still hear you.
The end of the thing, end of the road now.
So, did you grow up in a religious family at all? Like, was your family religious?
I would say that my family was not ritualistic, but I would say that they were committed. They were committed to their, Ismaili Muslim faith, and it's also, my family is a family of readers, so we would have a lot of intellectual discussions at home about religion, politics, what have you, but everyone was expected to sort of do their homework and read books.
Okay.
And read, magazines and newspapers. So we tried to have intelligent, critical conversations about things, religion included.
Nice.
So we were always welcome to sort of ask questions and raise doubts and sort of come up with our own theories of what we thought was going on. And I think that added to my academic ambition.
Interesting, because in my family, when I was growing up, there definitely wasn't that pressure to be like an accountant. Like, thankfully, my parents were like, you can do whatever you want. So I ended up in computer science. But not only that, I was lucky because coming from an Ismaili, I don't know if it's all Ismailis, but at least in my family, it was similar to what you said. It was like, you're free to question, you're free to doubt. As strange as it sounds, it's like there was no like threat of like, oh no, don't read that stuff. Which is very different from what I've heard in many, I guess, Sunni Muslim families and maybe some Ismaili families too, where it's like you're not allowed to question, you're not allowed to ask certain questions. Those are like taboo, and those are like, don't talk about that, don't discuss that. And I don't think that's healthy, for your child's growth to kind of like say, well, you can learn everything else, but for this, no, you can't ask questions on that.
No, I think this is definitely true. That the experience will differ. So, both my parents are university educated, and my own, like my mom and dad, like they used to read sort of what the equivalent of scholarly books on religion when they were in university. So for them, this wasn't new, and it was normal, and it was something to be encouraged, sort of an intellectual appraisal of your faith.
Wow.
It's important because, if you think about it, given today's conditions, like nobody should be forced to commit to a religious tradition and live that. Mm-hmm. It's just not, like, it's morally suspect, in my opinion. For whatever it's worth, I think it's problematic to force people to make it, because religion, whatever it is a commitment. But I think it has to be out of free choice, personally.
Yeah, but you still teach your kids what you believe, right? Like your kids are going to grow up in your religious faith, correct?
Well, yeah, they would. And I think that just like we raise our kids with our moral values, with our own culture, we try to impart to our children what we believe is for their well-being. Mm-hmm. So anybody who does have religious commitments and really has conviction in their religious practice and their orientation, it would make sense that they teach that to their children. But I think it would benefit anybody today to do their own personal search, as opposed to just being like, okay, I was raised this way, so I'm just going to uncritically accept and do. I think that can lead to problems.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised about the whole focus on academics, because before we get into that, like, how does the academic study of Islam differ from the way a Muslim believer views his faith? How would you explain that?
This is a very good question. And actually, this came up on Twitter, I think, several weeks ago. I've shared a few things about this, and other people have. And actually, I don't know if you saw, but there's sort of like a Twitter debate that happened among Muslims and others about whether the academic study of Islam even has any value.
Oh, so that's another question. That's another good question. Yeah, we can get into that as well. What's the point of that as well?
It's a good question. So I'm just going to put something on the screen. I don't know if
okay, I can put it on. 1 second. Yep. Okay, I can see your screen now.
So this is something that I helped make for Harvard's courses, a couple of religion courses. So I'm a teaching fellow, right? So I help teach some of the classes, and my supervisor, the supervising professor, sort of asked me to sort of create something, and everybody in the course gave their input. So this is what we came up with, and this is generalized, of course, but there are key differences that you can see in this table between how a believer will study religion, their own religious tradition, and how an academic will study it. The biggest difference, I think, is like when a believer is doing this study, at the end of the day, the believer is trying to find out what is truth for themselves. So their search is about formulating truth claims. Right? The believer is constructively looking. He or she wants to know, like, what is this truth? So the academic scholar of religion is not interested. His work or her work is not about coming up with what is truth. It's about studying how other human beings formulate truth.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a sense, you're not really studying religion per se. You're not really studying texts per se. The scholar of religion is studying other humans.
Is it kind of like anthropology then, in that sense?
So what will end up happening is the study of religion is an umbrella for several different disciplines. So in other words, this phenomenon we call religion, and let me be honest, today scholars are in no agreement on what religion really is and whether it's a real thing or whether it's just a category that we made up for convenience. There's no agreement on this. But whatever religion is, whatever we call religion, there are different ways of seeing that. And all these ways have limitations. So anthropology is one disciplinary way of analyzing religion. History is another way. Sociology is another way. Intellectual history is another way. What else is there? There are several. There are several disciplines that are part of the study of religion today. And we have to acknowledge that, especially for non-European religions, the discipline, this idea of studying people's religion or religious traditions or religious activity, that came very much out of two problematic origin points. The first is colonialism. So, when the British or the Germans or the Dutch or the French are colonizing different countries and nations and empires, there are scholars going, almost like informants, to study those people, the colonized people. So that is one of the origin points, and that leads to what you call Orientalism, where there's almost like an intentional sort of negative depiction of the colonized people. That's one origin point. Another origin point of what we today call the study of religion, Islam included, is there were Christian Protestant theologians from, say, the 17th century, 16th century onward, who were looking at religion from a Christian perspective. So they first believe only Christianity is a religion, and then they eventually admit Judaism and Islam as religions, and then the whole thing expands. So the study of religion partially began as a Christian project.
Interesting. It's evolved, yeah. Something I've noticed, something that kind of I've noticed about the difference between the way a believer looks at his religion in general versus, and I'm talking about Sunni Muslims here in particular, versus like an academic. So I had never been exposed to this academic, like, critical analysis of Islam until like very recently. As the entire time I was Muslim, I thought that the hadith was like God's given, like it was like I hadn't looked at anything critical of hadith. I was only looking at what I was taught from a dogmatic, and a lot of it was very Salafi leaning. So it was just like, after the Quran, the Sunnah, the Bukhari and Muslim is the most authentic thing after the Quran, like almost like it came down on like heavenly tablets, and this is very different from the academic perspective. So let's just as an example, like there's some criticism of hadith that goes above and beyond like what a believer would accept, like a Sunni Muslim would accept I mean, I'm speaking in general because obviously there's Sunni Muslims that accept all of this, but in general, like there's a big difference between what a believer would take from his books versus an academic would consider true, right?
But there will be some differences, but they don't have to be sort of game-breaking differences. So, for example, the idea that, if you talk about hadith, even within a religious tradition, there's a difference between, and I hate to use the word, but there's a difference between sort of what the masses are taught versus what the scholars within the religious tradition are taught. So, quite frankly, most of what academic study has said about hadith, none of it is news to, say, like an Al-Azhar trained scholar. Like, they know about all the problems. There are, I mean, this thing I have here shows there's two approaches, and methodologically, believer study and the academic study are different. They're different in terms of sort of the assumptions that you bring to the study.
What do you mean?
But, well, sure. Good question. So here's what we mean. So, for example, there's an assumption in the believer's approach that at some level there is some sort of information or guidance coming from the divine or the ultimate reality to affect the religious tradition's contents. There's some level of divine connection that's accepted and relied on, right? So, for example, if you study we can use the Quran as an example. We say ritual. Like, if you study a ritual with the assumption that, in the case of Islam, the Prophet authorized the ritual and that God exists, so the ritual brings you in touch with God, how you describe the ritual will be a certain way.
Okay.
Meanwhile, if I approach any ritual with an academic framework that says rituals are there, for example, if my framework says rituals are there to create identity, that's my assumption. So then my description when I write a book on these rituals, the whole argument will be about the rituals create identity in this way. So the theologian, so the believer who's doing this, he's doing what is called theology. So the theologian is going to describe ritual in one way. Maybe he's going to talk about how the ritual connects you with God, whereas the sociologist will describe ritual in another way, based on the framework that he or she uses, or an anthropologist will describe it. So a lot of anthropologists, for example, they might describe rituals as a way of a believer, a community member exercising their agency. Whereas the theological approach will be like, no, the ritual is about piety, it's about purifying your soul or your heart. Now, these two explanations, I personally don't think they contradict. I think they're at different levels. But depending on who you are and what your worldview is, you may conclude that there is a contradiction.
I see, yeah. So another kind of related question to that is, isn't studying Islam or any other religion just as valuable as studying Harry Potter, Star Trek, Star Wars, since none of this is actually true or empirically verifiable? What's the difference?
So a couple things. Whether these things are true or not is different for every person. There is no sort of universal consensus that all religions are false, right? So it's going to differ for every human agent, whether what is being studied has truth value or not. So for you, it may be akin to Harry Potter, but for, in the case of Islam, for at least 1.5 billion people, it's not. And I think this is where it's different from Harry Potter. So I think most people, almost, let's say 99% of the people who are fans of Star Trek or Harry Potter or Game of Thrones or whatever, I'm a Star Trek fan myself, we can be devoted to this thing, but we know it's not true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, the Trekkies and the Star Wars people, like, they know it's not true. Same with the Harry Potter fan. Like, they know it's not true. They'll obsess with it, but it's not.
Yeah.
Literally, right? But for a whole segment of Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, it is true. So therefore, the scholar of religion is not studying fiction
Yeah, I see.
for almost the whole globe. Like, it's not fiction. And because it's not fiction, it's taken seriously.
So how do historians actually study the Quran, and why? Like, for what reason?
It's a good question. The approach taken to the Quran, most of the approaches are either historical, literary, or both. The historical question, the Quran firstly has historical value. So you've already mentioned hadith, for example. So everyone knows that hadith, in terms of when they are written down, they come at least 150 years after Muhammad lived. And a hadith, as everyone knows, it is really a hearsay report about what Muhammad the Prophet said, did, authorized, and so on. So historically speaking, right, it's difficult on the face of it to to approach hadith as if they are literally historically describing what happened in the 600s.
Yeah.
And now, even from a sort of internal Sunni perspective, remember that most of these hadith compilations, like Bukhari and Muslim, they are used mainly for interpreting law, for fiqh.
Yeah.
They're not really used as historical sources per se. So even if the tradition grades a hadith as sahih, what that really means is, you can use this to make legal rulings, for example.
That's true.
The hadith themselves are not transmitted verbatim. So in other words, only the meaning is transmitted, even if you accept what the tradition says. So you're still not getting like pure history from them.
Wait,
but from an academic,
aren't they considered verbatim, the hadith?
No, so the hadith, the belief for most of the Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims is like, what the Prophet said, according to a hadith, was not transmitted through that chain of narrators word for word. It was transmitted in its sense or its meaning.
That's the first time I'm hearing this.
So if you want to reference one scholar, Jalaluddin Suyuti,
okay,
he wrote this book, Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran. And in that book, and I've translated the passage and I've read the passage itself, he basically says one of the differences between the Quran and the Hadith is that the Quran was transmitted verbatim, like word for word, by the reciters and the transmitters, but the Hadith was not.
What about the Hadith Qudsi? Same?
No, they're not.
Really?
They're not transmitted. Yeah, they're not transmitted
but like
verbatim.
In the Hadith collections, they have like multiple versions with like slightly different narrations.
I think that's part of the point. That's sort of part of the point. That's sort of a proof of that it's not transmitted verbatim. And sometimes you have hadiths where like different people are narrating the same event, and like it's the same event, but like the description still differs. And a lot of I don't remember like what the guy said.
There's hadith that says I forgot if you said this or this. It's like, okay, which one is it?
So the thing with the difficulty with hadith for a historian is because they're written so late, you cannot use a hadith as a primary source.
Is that? I mean, maybe this is kind of going off topic a bit, but is that a similar issue with the New Testament rather? Because it was also like talking like decades after the time of when Jesus actually lived and said the things that were claimed that he said by these people that we don't even know who wrote the Gospels, right?
The New Testament, it's a bit different because as far as, I mean, look, I have no expertise in New Testament. I'd have to ask my friends. But as far as I know, the Gospel, like the Gospel of Mark, for example, based on the content, most scholars estimate that Gospel of Mark is written, I think, in like 60 or 70 or something, like AD, which is about like 30, 40 years after Jesus. Now, that's some distance, but that's not 150 years. Now, of course, it doesn't have a chain of transmitters, which makes it somewhat difficult. There is a belief that there's an oral tradition that Mark is sort of writing down that he received. It's not
But
even Mark who wrote the gospel. We don't know.
yeah,
But that
it's attributed
gap is not the same, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, true.
30, 40 years versus 150 years or something. It's different. Anyway,
You go ahead. Go ahead.
so the point is that if you want to talk about early Islam, so 7th century Islam, or if you want to talk about 7th century Islam, and if you want to talk about Muhammad as a historical figure, Hadith cannot be like your first stop. If you just rely on Hadith at face value, you're not getting the historical Muhammad. You're getting the Muhammad remembered by a certain party of Muslims who have a certain priority in the 800s. That's what you're getting.
Isn't the seerah, like what I was taught as a Sunni Muslim, was the seerah is even less, not reliable, but basically, like, let's say less reliable than the hadith. Like that's what, even though it comes earlier, like Ibn Ishaq, they don't use seerah for fiqh. So with Sunni Muslims, there's always this, like, whenever something is used for fiqh, and you know this because you shared a paper with me about this from Jonathan Brown, like, it has to be at a higher standard than just whether it's talking about something that happened. Some like recollecting or talking about, like, describing Jannah or hell or heaven. But when it comes to fiqh, it's like there's a higher standard that's needed for the hadith. And seerah is not used for fiqh at all, for Islamic law, right?
Yeah, as far as I know, the difference is that the seerah, or what they call seerah and magazi, this is a different tradition. You could say seerah and magazi are a different project than the hadith. So you're dealing with two different truth projects that are being done by different groups of Muslims with different priorities. So this author, Shahab Ahmed, he talked about how Seerah Magazi, you have to look at all of these as different genres of literature. And the Seerah Magazi, the goal is to tell this epic story about the rise of Islam and Prophet Muhammad, almost like following the hero's archetype to a certain degree. That's in the Seerah. So, like, the Seerah is influenced by a certain story arc. This is what Shahab Ahmed writes. The goal of Hadith is not to write a history, because when you read the Hadith, it's not categorized.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's like...
Hadith is to prepare a corpus that eventually will be equated to the concept of Sunnah.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the early community, the proto-Sunni community, needs material on which the legal tradition, fiqh, is going to rely on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before the Hadith are put on paper and then canonized, the concept of Sunnah is there, but the word Sunnah means different things to different people. So if, like, for people in Medina, the Sunnah, what we call the Sunnah, is just the customary practice of Medina. Whereas for others, it's like the customary practice of Kufa.
Yeah.
Whereas for other people, Sunnah is just sort of like, what it's included in Sunnah is sort of like common sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
rational thing.
They included.
So Sunnah
go ahead.
Idea during like the first 150 years, 200 years, Sunnah is an open concept, and there's evidence that Muslims accepted as authoritative different people's Sunnahs. So there's Sunnah of the Prophet, but there's also the Sunnah of Abu Bakr, the Sunnah of Umar, the Sunnah of certain caliphs. There's this general term, like the just Sunnah.
Khulafa Rashidin.
There's the Sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs. Yeah. There's also the Sunnah of the Umayyad caliphs. So sometimes, like, there's reports that an Umayyad caliph, like Umar ibn Abdulaziz, that he could institute Sunnah.
So this is I didn't hear this as a Muslim. What I did hear, and there's actually almost like a de-emphasis. So as a Sunni Muslim, like, clearly, like Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman, they did a bunch of things that actually became, like, legalized or canonized as part of the religious tradition. For example, Omar, for the Fajr Adhan, the call to prayer for the morning prayer, he added as-salatu khairum minan nawm, prayer is better than sleep. But I was always wondering, as a Sunni Muslim, I'm like, how does that work? Because I thought all of this has to come from Muhammad, and Muhammad is speaking to Allah, so he's authorized to do this. But then I was told, well, the Sunnah of the Khulafa Rashidin, they're actually, which again was kind of confusing to me, because like, who's rightly guided? Who decides that, right? You know what I mean? And so there's a bunch of things in Sunni Islam that come from the Khulafa, the four caliphs, that actually are not coming from Muhammad. Like, for example, that. The other thing is a Tarawih prayer, which became institutionalized. I think Omar institutionalized it. Uthman put the Quran into one book. So there's a bunch of things that we can talk about there. I don't want, maybe that'll be a little bit too much off track, but do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, without getting into so many details, and once again, like I'm this entire conversation, I'm just sort of speaking as someone who studied this academically. So you're not going to have. There's some matters there's no scholarly consensus on, so you'll read different things. But generally, what it looks like is, in one sense, what constitutes proper Islam is much more open. It's actually quite more open during the first 500 years. Even this idea of the four rightly guided caliphs, it took some time for them to settle for the four, because initially, within the first 200 years, the status of Ali as a rightly guided caliph was hotly disputed.
What?
There were factions, there were pro-Umayyad factions and pro-Uthman factions who did not consider Ali to be a legitimate caliph. Remember there was the whole civil war that happened, the first civil war, and then Ali's descendants, Hassan and Hussein, are in conflict with the Umayyads, right?
Yeah.
So, and remember, a lot of the original, when hadith start proliferating in the late 1st century, or 2nd century, who's in power? The Umayyads are in power. So we have to keep that in mind, that a lot of this very sort of triumphalist story that we read about Islam and Muhammad in the Sirah, I'm not saying it's false. I take a what you call tradition critical approach. I think there is historical truth in there, but we have to work to find it, and that means comparing a lot of different sources. So I take a tradition critical, source critical approach to these sources. But we have to keep in mind that this is part of an Umayyad imperial project to tell the story in a certain way where the Umayyad dynasty is the outcome and almost the fulfillment of that story. So the Umayyads saw themselves as God's caliphs, as divinely inspired, divinely chosen. Their whole lineage, they believe, was special. They believe that they are... it's ironic because many of the titles that the Shia will give their imams, the Umayyads are claiming it at the same time.
Interesting. I didn't know this.
So that the sources are sort of like, there's a lot of sort of Umayyad-oriented stuff, and because of this, remember the Umayyads, like they did not like Ali ibn Abi Talib. They cursed him and so on. So he was not accepted as the so-called fourth caliph until after Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Ahmed ibn Hanbal was a big supporter of Ali, and he really made a push for Ali to be counted as a rightly guided caliph.
Wow. I think, these are some of the things that you learn when you study Islam, and some of the things... Okay, one more interesting reflection I have to bring up is a lot of the things that you're saying, they're intentionally not taught in the mosques. Like, I remember that, like, looking at some websites and reading about certain things, they actually said we shouldn't talk badly about the companions. So, for example, how Aisha got into a war, with Zubair, and she got into a war against Ali. We're not supposed to talk about that. We're not supposed to talk about the fact that, Muawiyah, what he did, and how, because Allah is pleased with him, because, there's this dogmatic belief among Sunni Muslims that all of the companions are, Allah is pleased with them, which is kind of odd, but there's a statement in the Quran, radiyallahu an, something like that, it talks about the companions, and so Sunnis interpret it that anybody that even met the Prophet, he's a companion, and so you cannot say anything bad about him whatsoever, even if he made a mistake. So they're like, oh, may Allah forgive him, or these things are not talked about, because it kind of, I don't know, like it doesn't go well for the narrative, maybe.
So one thing to keep in mind is what you're describing is, firstly, I mean, we can't generalize about all Sunnis, but like this idea of narrating history a certain way, this is typical for like all faith communities. Like everybody does this. This is not, if you go to a 12er Shia or Ismaili Shia congregation or a Sufi congregation, everybody will relate history, like, and they'll omit things and they'll emphasize other things. So you're going to find this, but definitely the picture that we are sometimes given, that there was a golden age after Muhammad died and it's the golden age of the fourth caliph, I mean, this is simply not true. That's why there's like 2 civil wars happening in the first 100 years after Muhammad dies. So, there's conflict, and in a sense, the fact that there is contestation, this is quite typical for religious movements. After the death of the charismatic founder. I mean, you're going to have this. But I want to sort of move back to the Quran. So we talk about how the Hadith come 150 years later. So you can't use them as a primary historical source. You can use them as a primary source for their own time. And there is some method of academic analysis where you can look at hadiths that have been transmitted in multiple channels, and if you sort of compare all the chains, you may find that a lot of the hadith actually go back to like a certain individual from which it branches off. So they call that common links. And some scholars, I think this is a good method, what they're able to do is they can actually say, well, the hadith definitely existed. It was definitely narrated by this common link person. And what that does is, on certain hadiths, you can push back the date, sometimes by 100 years. So now some hadith, you can at least say that this story existed in the 1st century. And that, people...
Do you have an example
4 or
of
5
that?
generations. Yeah, so there's several scholars. Some of the names are Gregor Scholler and Harold Modsky. He passed away recently, unfortunately. And Andreas Gork. So these are 3 scholars, and they have all taken this approach to hadith. And Gregor Scholler, for example, he wrote a book called The Biography of Muhammad, where he analyzed a handful of these hadith, where he's able to sort of date the hadith earlier than when it was written.
Oh, okay.
And what that means is, what he's found is a general outline of Muhammad's mission, like the fact that he got the first revelation, at a certain at this cave, Hira. The fact that there was a hijrah, for example. I think he also analyzed the story of Aisha and the adultery accusation. So he's picked a few things, and he's been able to date them earlier. And that can give us a bit more confidence into the historicity in terms of the outline. Okay. So that, Muhammad was in Mecca, and then he moved, there was a hijrah, and he was in Medina, and so on. So that's helpful for scholars. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the only primary source that we have, one of the only primary sources that we have from Muhammad's lifetime, that gives you a window into Muhammad's lifetime and the life of his community, is the Quran.
But what was an example of a hadith that was dated back? Do you have an example off the top of your head, or no?
Yeah, so the fact that Muhammad is meditating in a cave, and then he has an experience at the cave, like that can be dated to the end of the 1st century, according to this method.
Okay.
The fact that there was a hijrah can be dated to the end of the 1st century.
Okay, so but are those hadith, or are those actual hadith?
They're hadith.
Okay.
They are reports, right, about this is what Muhammad did, and he said this, and he saw this. So they're transmitted as hadith. They have chains. They appear in the seerah, but they also appear in the later hadith literature. So they're transmitted by so many people that it's possible to do a full-out analysis and push back the date.
Oh, okay.
Of those.
And then you were saying,
about, like, a handful of these. I think Juan Cole, in his book a new book on Muhammad, I think he talked about there's like 8 reports like this, that you're like there's 8 of these sort of stories that can be pushed back a bit earlier than, I think by 100 years, and that's valuable historically. But really, the Quran, according to most scholars, the Quran is a transcript, more or less, of what Muhammad recited. It's not in order chronologically, but content-wise, provides us with a window into those 20, 22, 23 years of his mission. And we can, as historians, if we want to talk about what is early Islam and the life of Muhammad, we have to begin with the contents of the Quran.
Well, what do you think about the theory that Muhammad and the Quran were invented by the Umayyads and redacted over 200 years? Or even that Muhammad didn't exist, and he's like, there's an idea that Jesus didn't exist that some people they bring up. Mainly Richard Carrier, brought this idea about, or popularized it, I guess. What do you, just before we get into the details of the Quran, let's just call that out. Like, did Muhammad exist?
So in academia, the funny thing is, in academia, you will find like at least one person taking a position that you think nobody could take. So you probably, if you try hard enough today, you might find some academics who don't think Muhammad existed and who think the whole thing has been invented. It's certainly not the academic consensus. But I'm not going to sort of give you an argument from authority. We can say this much. If you put aside the Muslim traditional sources, and if you put aside the Quran for a second, there come to light testimony from non during the 7th century that either they mention Muhammad by name, or they basically say like a prophet of the Ishmaelites has risen. This is what he taught, and this was of course done in conquest, right? So after Muhammad, there's like these conquests by the early caliphs, like they conquer Jerusalem and they conquer Persia and stuff. So you have Christians writing in Egypt and Jerusalem, and Zoroastrian writers and others who are actually talking about how there's this like sort of like army of people coming, or these Arabs are coming, and they believe in this prophet. And then 1 or 2 of these sources mentions Muhammad by name, and this starts from like 630s onward. Now, I find it hard to believe that all these people like are actually part of an Umayyad conspiracy. They're not Muslims. That's one angle. Another thing is, again, put aside the Muslim seerah and whatever. If an Umayyad caliph invented Muhammad as a person and the whole story, why is it that even in the 1st century, you have Shi'i groups, you have the Khawarij, you have all these separate factions who don't agree on like the succession to Muhammad? They don't agree on theology. They disagree about so many things, and yet they all agree about like there was this prophet named Muhammad, like who uttered the Quran. Like, how is it possible that these groups that are fighting each other, right? Some of them are rebelling against each other. How did an Umayyad somehow cause them to get amnesia?
Yeah.
And accept this fake story? So here's the thing, like, it's perfectly academic to propose this theory. But at the end of the day, does your theory explain the evidence? Or does your theory require more evidence that does not exist to be found to explain the theory?
Yeah.
So my opinion, for whatever it's worth, is that the idea that Muhammad was invented by the Umayyads, like wholly, I don't think it holds any merit. Similarly, there was a time where, before a lot of the manuscripts were found, some scholars, including people like Andrew Rippin, and Andrew Rippin is a big major scholar, the late Andrew Rippin, major scholar of Islamic studies, but even he believed that the Quranic text was sort of formed and edited over 200-300 years. This used to be a thing.
Okay.
But based on the manuscript evidence that has come out, and you can find a lot of it on Islamic Awareness, that website, Islamic Awareness, you have like 1st century manuscripts with parts of the Quran, and you have the Sunnah manuscripts. And it's very difficult now to say that the Quran was slowly invented or slowly written over 300 years. It's hard to take that position now.
You
Also,
also,
the Quran does have later, most documents that are invented over a period, they contain content of events that happened during the period they were written in. Yet the Quran contains nothing about the first two civil wars and the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Like, if it was invented, don't you think that the writers would use this invented scripture to legitimize these later empires? Like, you would find references, like in the Hadith, you find references to the Rashidun Caliphs and Umayyads, and you don't find in the Quran. So that's why I don't think the Quran, I don't buy that late origins theory anymore, and I don't think most scholars of Quranic studies don't buy that theory anymore.
and I believe you don't buy the Dan Gibson Petra theory either.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have no expertise on this. I mean, we simply, like, I know nothing about the topic of Qiblas. All I know is that Dan Gibson has been, like, heavily refuted by, I think his name is David King. So, like, David King actually works on this particular subject. Like, that's what he's done his whole life. Like, sort of like medieval, pre-modern, like, astrology and like position of stars and maps and geography. Like, this is his thing. And David King has, on academia, he has written like several pieces basically saying Dan Gibson is like dead wrong. I think the gist of it was that the reason why a lot of these early Qiblas, they don't exactly face Mecca is that in some, Dan Gibson was using like Google Maps to like sort of like, he was using maps from like Google Earth and all this. And King was like, they didn't have the technology to make it face the right way. So they actually believed there was a certain direction that was Mecca, and it just wasn't. That's the gist. I can't really do justice to that refutation, but if you just Google David King, like on academia.edu, you'll find like at least 2 or 3 papers he's written against Dan Gibson's thesis, saying like it's complete, like it's very problematic.
So going back to before the side thing we went on, you wanted to say something about the Quran and how the Quran is used, you're saying, in a sense, because it's the sayings of Muhammad, the recitation of Muhammad, or something like that you were saying?
Yeah, so what I'm saying, and this is, I think the consensus of Quranic studies and Islamic studies historians accepts this. The Quran's content, although the form has changed, right? So now we're dealing with a book transcript of recitations, but the recitations themselves more or less represent or convey what Muhammad recited over his 20-year, 22-year mission. And what that means is that we can use the Quran to reconstruct Muhammad as a historical figure, his message, and what he was engaging with in his lifetime, during his, at least from the time he's a prophet. So many historians will read the Quran as a historical document. So remember, the academic study of Islam, like whether you really believe in Islam or not, need not be relevant to your inquiry. So you can be like, well, there's this Quran, I see it as a historical witness to Muhammad and Muhammad's community, and I'm going to read it for that information that it can tell me. And the most famous person who's done this recently is Fred Donner. He wrote a book called Muhammad and the Believers, and using the Quran as the main source. Now he'll use a few other sources too, but what you do is you anchor the whole thing in the Quran. So you only use later reports like Hadith or other sources insofar as they're consistent with the Quran. And often when you find something inconsistent with the Quran, you like value it less. That's the general approach. So he wrote this book. Donner wrote this. It's a very good book. People don't agree with everything he says, but he basically says that initially Muhammad's movement was known as the believer movement, the mu'minun, and their religious orientation was not actually known as Islam with like proper I. Islam was in the Quran as a generic term. they're known as believers, and he says this is a monotheistic revival movement. It's not really a new religion per se. And he basically says things like, at some point, some Jews and Christians could be considered believers too, if their theology and righteous conduct sort of lines up with what Muhammad was teaching. And Donner further says that the term Islam and the term Muslim in the Quran, they're used generically. So they're not identity markers in the Quran. They become the name of a new religion and of identity only in like the late 7th century with the Umayyads.
Oh, interesting.
That's the gist.
Okay.
So if you read the Quran, remember this is reading the Quran as a 7th century document, which is different from reading the Quran as a believer in the 21st century, or the 10th century, or the 8th century, where tafsir, what we call Quran commentary, they read the Quran differently than the historian reads the Quran.
Can you talk about that a bit more, like the tafsir? One of the most popular ones is Ibn Kathir, which I even have a copy myself. Actually, I think we gave it away now. But anyways, I had a copy at one point in my house. It's very well respected in the community. In general, like people love that tafsir for whatever reason. And there's other ones too. There's Maududi has a tafsir, Tafhim al-Quran, and but the most, I guess, famous one that I know people read is Ibn Kathir. And even sometimes you'll get non-Muslims attacking Islam. They'll take this tafsir and they'll say, look, this tafsir says this verse means this, so that's what it means. Look, even the tafsir says that. That's what they'll say, for example. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. So there's a few points to be made on this. So the first is, in general, there's a big difference between how tafsir approaches the Quran and how the Quran itself would have been experienced by the 7th century community. The big difference is this. Today, we think the Quran is a book that you open and you read from like start to finish. Mm-hmm. A lot of scholars do this too. But let's think back to the 7th century, assuming Muhammad existed and assuming he proclaimed the what we today call the Quran. These are reasonable assumptions academically. Mm-hmm. The word Quran means recital, recitation, and it's something that's fundamentally oral, mm-hmm. not written.
Yeah.
So according to the Quran itself and according to Muslim tradition, what we call the Quran is not originally a text or a book. It's not even something that the author, whoever you believe the author is, sort of decides in a sort of premeditated way, like an author today. You know, today when you write a book, you like outline the whole book and then you make notes and then you slowly flush it out. So the Quran's origins historically is not that. So we're not dealing with a book, and we're not dealing with something that was even formulated to be a book. We're dealing with a series of recitations, mm-hmm. and each recitation is called a Quran, right? Like a Quran. So I'm actually gonna put something on the screen if it's okay.
Yep, I'll share this. So why does it say kitab? Why does the Quran use the word kitab or book?
So I'll get to that,
okay.
But let me sort of try to share what it looks like. Okay, so maybe people can see this. Okay, so what you're dealing with, this is according to my research as a scholar, and there are other scholars that sort of who've done this, and my work corroborates their work and so on. So what we're dealing with, this is the Quran as a 7th century event, not a book. We're talking about a live event. And it's that's about 20 years, and what's happening is Muhammad is reciting Qurans, recitations, which consist really of small portions of verses. So he's reciting these, and as this quote by Adam Flowers says, he's reciting it in response, I'll just highlight this, in response to particular events or debates within the earliest Muslim community. So just think about it like this. So like something happens and then Quranic verses are recited in reference and in interaction with that. Somebody asks a question, Quranic verses are recited to address the question. Somebody is invading, Quranic verses are recited to tell them what to do, like if there's an invasion. So we're looking at what you see on the screen here, a series of separate recitations. And each segment of recitation, in a sense, it would function as a freestanding unit. You know what I mean?
What do you mean?
So, well, we're looking at, like, the analogy I use is this. Like, the original Quran as an oral event is somewhat analogous to the experience of using Google Maps.
Okay.
So think about it, like Google Maps, and you just pop in your destination, right? And now this thing will start orally telling you where to go. And then when you make a wrong turn, it will reroute you. And then if the route you're taking becomes like full of traffic, it's gonna like reroute you and find you another route. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So how does Google Maps work? It just keeps improvising. It keeps giving you updated directions as the circumstances shift. So I propose that that's how the Quran originally functions when Muhammad is proclaiming it. Mm-hmm. And now, if you notice, books don't behave like that.
Yeah.
Like, a book is finished.
Yeah.
It doesn't respond to you. It doesn't interact. It doesn't, abrogate its own. It doesn't change its own guidance. So this is what we're dealing with. Now, you asked this question. You said, why does it call itself Kitab, right?
Yeah.
So you're right. Like, the irony here is this Quran is oral, and it's not behaving like a book. And while it's being like this, it calls itself a kitab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, obviously, whatever kitab means in the 7th century in the Quran, when the Quran calls itself a kitab, it cannot mean a physical book. Because you're not dealing with a physical book.
There was no physical book.
As it turns out, there was no physical book, right? The physical book, i.e. one corpus of all the different recitations, so all the Qurans, they only come together later on after Muhammad has died. We don't even have evidence Muhammad left a physical book. But it's calling itself kitab. So what could that mean? Now, actually, the Arabic word kitab, according to most research, it comes from the Aramaic word katab. And if you look up katab, and if you look up kitab in an early dictionary from like the 8th century, the first meaning that you get is not book, but the verb means to sew. To sew something together. That is what kitab means. So wait, what does that mean? What could this, So literally the meaning is to sort of bring together different things, to bind things together. So the root meaning of kitab, like in the Quranic context, is not really book, but God's decree or writing. And I mean writing in the sense of prescribing. Mm-hmm. So writing in an oral culture is also a symbol for authority, i.e. to lay something down. It is written, as they say, or so-and-so has prescribed something. So I believe, and few other scholars are on board with this, the Quran calls itself, and it calls any revelation, kitab, with the meaning of this is God's decree. Mm-hmm. What God has prescribed, not with the meaning of this is a physical finished book on paper.
That is one of the meanings of kataba, right, as well, in the Quran itself, where Allah says, I decreed this and this on the children of Israel, that they will do this and do that. So the kataba word is definitely used in that sense as well. Knowing what we know now, that Muhammad didn't write the Quran down during his life, it wasn't in one book. It was memorized, here and there. It was written here and there, but it wasn't put together as a book. Do you ever think it was Muhammad's intention that it would be put into a book and basically preserved in the form that we have today? Because I don't know if we get to this today or not, but there's some things about the preservation as well that we could talk about. But what do you think about the idea of the Quran being preserved in a book form and being used, like you said, in a very different way than how it was used at the time of Muhammad? So when Muhammad was alive, it was like, engaging with the people, engaging with the circumstances. It was like, this is happening, do this, do that. But now you have this book, and you're trying to kind of extract general guidelines and things out of it on how to live your life. It's very different, right? It's not what happened at the time of Muhammad, right? It was what happened after Muhammad died is actually quite a transformation.
It is. So first, generally speaking, there could be different reasons for putting something into a book. The original, if we sort of accept what the tradition says, one reason was simply pragmatic. They were afraid that those who would memorize the Quran were dying off in battles, and they wanted to sort of preserve it. And that's now, if you're talking about sort of preservation, writing something down for preservation, that was happening during Muhammad's lifetime by all indications. So people were writing down different surahs with very minimal, what they call skeletal Arabic, on different materials, and it served as a what they call like memory aid for the reciter. So really it's memorized, and then the text that you get is just a support to the oral transmission. So that is typically what Muhammad probably had in mind. So you're dealing with a oral Quran or oral Qurans in the form of surah. So at some point, I think Muhammad did this, but I don't know. I mean, we don't know. But at some point, they put verses together to form surahs. The early Meccan surahs seem to be delivered already like that because they're short. But I think in the Medinan period, they're putting verses together to form surahs for the purpose of recitation.
The Sunni view, isn't it that Angel Gabriel taught Muhammad something, the order or something like that?
Yeah, there's a hadith in the Sunni corpus that says the year he died, Gabriel came and rehearsed, recited all with Muhammad. So the general idea from the Sunni tradition is Muhammad, through Gabriel's instruction, that he authorized the surah formation. Now, whether you buy that literally or not, I think it's probably strong evidence that the surahs are early. The surahs are... So one thing about the Sana'a manuscript, and you guys have talked about the Sana'a manuscript, but I want to comment that the funny thing about it was you guys on one of your talks... You guys
means me and Abdullah Gondal, right? Yeah.
You were saying that, the Sana'a manuscript casts doubt on the preservation of the Quran, and it raises problematic questions for Muslims. And I guess, you're speaking to some sort of conception of what the Quran is and how it's transmitted.
Yes.
But in academia, that article, and one of my friend, he was a co-author.
Yeah.
One of the co-authors, I know the person.
Galdazi?
That article, so that article on Sana'a in academic discourse actually gave strong evidence for the preservation of the Quran.
Is it? Okay.
Because in academia, we were dealing with a situation where we don't have any pre-Uthmanic Qurans, right? All you have is you have Uthmanic manuscripts. And there was a big question mark of, well, what does the Quran look like apart from Uthman's version of the text?
Yeah.
And the hadith tell you all about companion codices and variants, but no one had seen this. Now, what they saw with Sana'a is, yes, there are variants in verses. Frankly, they're all insignificant. For example, by insignificant, I mean, they don't really alter, the character of the Quran or Muhammad's message or anything like that. They're not significant overall. But one thing they found is the surahs, the surah order wasn't the same, but the actual, surahs are the same. So that means, if this Sana'a Quran is contemporary with Uthman's, and they both have the same arrangements of the verses into surahs, it means the surahs themselves, the surah arrangement, not the order of the surahs in the text, but the fact that these verses are in this surah, that is pre-Uthmanic.
So these pre-Uthmanic...
And that's significant.
These pre-Uthmanic surahs had differences in the ordering of words, and sometimes the form of a certain word was different, and so the way I interpreted that, or I understood that, is that the Quran, by the time it got to the Uthmani version, basically the Cairo Standard Edition that we have today, there were some changes between something that was before that and this one. Now, what Sunni Muslims have kind of countered with was, oh no, these copies that were found in the Sana'a mosque, these were like study copies. These were like student copies where there was mistakes in it. So they were trying to say, no, this, which I don't think is what the academic argument is. The academic argument is not, this is some like weird, strange, obscure, like faulty copy, but this was more like, this was the copy that existed before the standard edition that we have today existed. So I agree with you that they're not, let's call them not major changes, but it casts doubt into the narrative that's being spread today, not among academics, but among lay people, that not even a dot or jot or nothing in the Quran has changed, and what we have is the verbatim word of God as came down to Muhammad. It casts some doubt into that narrative that Gabriel, Muhammad, Uthmani, it's not a straight line. There's some bumps in there, and it seems like there may have been some changes along the way. That's what we took from it. Would you agree with that?
Again, like I don't have any issue in what you actually said. My issues as an academic is how you framed it.
Okay.
Because I don't know if you remember on Facebook, but like we tagged Mohsen Gudarzi in one of your guys' threads, and he was just shocked at sort of like how you guys were interpreting.
I think I asked him to watch the video, and he said he would, and he never got back. I said, you should watch the video and let me know, and then he never did. So I didn't get any official sort of feedback on that.
Sure. So here's what I would say. The Sunni tradition, it's not just academics who know about this. Sunni traditional scholars, they all know about this. Like, they know, they are taught, at least they should not be taught that like every vowel and every dot was transmitted, from Gabriel to Muhammad to Uthman. They shouldn't be taught that. Their own sources tell us that, they say a number of things. So, firstly, there are reports, hadith, that some people think are historical, where two people, one, you know this, but we should talk about it anyway.
The seven qira'at, right?
Yeah, not the seven qira'at. So there's a confusion. So we'll talk about all this. So firstly, the best article to summarize everything I'm about to say, this is not my research. I don't work on variants at all. The best article is by Yasin Dutton. And it's called, the Seven Ahruf Hadith. It's an academic article. You should actually read it yourself and do your own little blog on it.
Okay. All right.
But here's the upshot of this article. So Yasin Dutton is a Muslim, and if you want to learn more about this, Google his name put his name on YouTube search, and you'll find a 5-hour workshop where he goes through some of this.
Okay.
And you can listen. I listened myself. Anyway, here's the thing. So Yasin Dutton believes, and I have no reason to doubt what he said. He believes that there's two or three hadith. There were several hadith where somebody hears. Sometimes it's Omar, sometimes it's Ubay ibn Ka'b, but somebody. So let's say it's Omar. So Omar hears someone, I forgot the name, reciting Surah Al-Furqan.
Yeah.
Differently than how he heard it.
I remember that hadith, yeah.
And he's disturbed by this, right? So he goes to Muhammad, the prophet, and he says, brings the guy to the prophet, and he says, recite, look, oh prophet, I'm not doing it literally, but like he basically alerts the prophet that there's a difference, right? Yeah. Reciting the same way as I heard you say it. And then the prophet says, oh, person, recite. So he recites in front of the prophet. And the prophet said, that's how it was revealed. That's how it was sent down. And then Omar, or whoever the companion is, like, well, how can they both be correct? And the prophet says, it was sent down, the Quran was sent down according to 7 ahruf, which literally means 7 letters or 7 aspects, or 7 dimensions. Nobody knows what this ahruf means. There's speculation. But the point is, 2 people from the same Qurayshi tribe are reciting the same surah differently. So there must be some word differences, right? Prophet, on an ad hoc basis, he has said that they're both correct. There's other reports that the same thing. The names are changed, but it's the same report. So Yasin Dutton believes that this is true, that he believes, and I have no reason to doubt him. Remember, this is an oral culture. The Quran is oral, and part of the culture is that people would, quote unquote, tweak a poem when they recite it. It's just normal. The example Yasin Dutton gives is like if you ask a band to play a song over like 30 years in an oral culture, like the song's not going to be exactly the same. Like 30 years of live concerts. But if you ask them, is this the same song? They'll be like, yes, it is. So there seems to be an acceptable amount of variability in Quran as recited during the oral phase, during Muhammad's lifetime. Now, in addition to that, there's these reports that, again, Yasin Dutton, I believe, I follow him on this, I believe they reflect historical reality, where, you know the story of the prophet's reciting a verse for one of his scribes, and the scribe writes at the end of the verse, and there's two names of God that the prophet recites. The scribe writes down something else. He writes two different names. What does the prophet say?
It's good. It's right?
He says that's how it was revealed, or he says that's fine, or like different versions, or he says, well, whatever, what I say or whatever you put, it's fine. Like that's how it was revealed. One report says like the person was so like disturbed that he sort of apostatized. You know,
I remember that.
Like, he couldn't. Now think about this. Like this again means, if you take it as reflection of history, that there is acceptable, authorized variability in Quran recitation while Muhammad is alive. And the companion notices, they simply may reflect that. So like Ibn Masud's variants and Ibn Ubay's variants and the Sana variants, like it could just be these differences. Now, what happens, this is just from a physical point of view, the Uthmanic writing cannot capture all this variability. So the writing it down into the Uthmanic Mus'haf is turning an orally anchored Quran into a Quran that's still oral, but now the writing is placing limitations on its form. So a lot of the variability will be lost. That does not mean that something was changed, because there's no original here.
I think that idea. Go ahead, Sai.
Sorry. The other thing to remember about this is, if you look at my little diagram on the screen, the kitab is like the Quran. They have these different recitations, right? And they are what you could say they're manifestations of God's decree. Like the recitation is not identical to God's kitab. It is conveying God's kitab. So the recitation's integrity, or the status of a certain recitation on being divinely revealed, is not contingent on it possessing the exact same vowels and words. The status of something being revealed depends on, can this recitation convey to the hearer the real substance of God's kitab? So that the variability is okay.
So that
allow
that variability, I think what Abdullah Gondal and myself were trying to point out was, we don't feel that this is something. It was definitely not what we were taught as Muslims, that there's this variability in the recitation of the Quran, and that this one authorized one that we have today is not the end all and be all of the Quran, but there's like multiple. Of course, the seven dialects or 7 ahruf, or the variant readings of the Quran, to us, strike us, or even the whole. I mean, the whole thing strikes us as a very human thing, a very human experience of like, responding to circumstances as they happen in the life of Muhammad and his community. So I think that's where we were coming at it from the perspective of atheists. We don't see this as God planning this from before the creation of the universe, but more as Muhammad, guiding his community to the best of his ability, and so some of these variants that came out of it, we were pointing out that this doesn't seem to be a divine thing. That's basically what we were trying to do, where we were going with that line of reasoning.
So I understand that, but to some extent, you're also arguing against a straw man. Mm-hmm. Like, you're arguing against a position that, like, is not really, it's not really sort of what the scholarly tradition of Sunni Islam is asserting, mm-hmm. right? You're arguing against what you could say a populist position that actually doesn't even have merit within the tradition itself.
Yeah.
And the key that I want to emphasize again is that the oral Quran, in whatever form it has, the oral Quran is pointing to something beyond itself. And if that's understood, and that is, I believe, this sort of what I'm saying here, I believe this here. Here's another slide, okay? Mm-hmm. So my analysis of if I read the Quran and ask the Quran, how does the Quran understand revelation? Okay, so I can analyze the Quran this way, whether I believe it or not, whether it really is from.
I think I lost Khalil. I think I lost you for a second. Okay, you're back now. Go ahead. Sorry, I just lost you for a second.
So I was saying that, like, there's a way to analyze the Quran, its content, to determine what is the Quran's understanding of its own revelation. Mm-hmm. Now, many people today, for whatever reason, especially those who are not theologically literate, they look at the Quran as a book as basically that is revelation. Like, the book form is the revelation, and that's how God made it, and Muhammad delivered the book. He just delivered it in parts, but the whole book was there, right? Like, this is a very populist view. And part of this view is that the whole book was written in heaven, and it was merely transported to earth. Now, I would say that view of the Quran is not in the Quran, for many reasons I already gave you. The Quran is oral, and as you say, the Quran is evolving, it's piecemeal, it's improvised, it's ad hoc, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Quran, if you examine the Quran, if you read it for what it means in the 7th century, and if you don't rely on what a later mufassir or what later mutakallim, what they say, I believe on what you see on the screen here, this is what you'll find in the Quran, where you have to distinguish between what I call a transcendent kitab, which is something that's celestial. This is the kitab that sort of contains everything in it, all knowledge and all divine knowledge, right? It exists like always, doesn't change. And that kitab is not the Quran, this top one here. This is an archetypal kitab. And what happens in Revelation is content, like i.e. knowledge, guidance from the transcendent kitab is revealed, i.e. it's transformed, it's given oral form, and it's historicized, and it's recited by Muhammad. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't have to believe this is true, but what I'm saying is the Quran as a historical document, this is how the Quran understands revelation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is what Muhammad would have seen it, and this is what people in that early community, they would have understood it in this way. So what you see here is that you have multiple recitations, Qurans, they're happening through history, and their role, what they're doing is they're conveying this sort of higher level content in a lower level form.
Yeah.
And when we talk about transmission, like variant readings, variant this, ahruf, vowels and so on, the transmission does not affect the transcendent level.
Yeah, but we
affects that lower level.
But there was an example you gave of Abdullah ibn Abi Sar, and how he was, even one of the writers of the Quran was actually disturbed by the fact that Muhammad allowed this change. That he mentioned these other two names of Allah, like the Al-Hakim Al-Aziz instead of Al-Rahim kawa, whatever, right? I don't think we were arguing against a straw man. I think what we were doing was two things. One was we were showing that the popular view is a much stronger position in the minds of lay people, because what it says is there's one Quran that Allah sent down, that this is the book, and this was from, the preserved tablet up in Jannah or whatever, and it came down, and it was, before the creation of the heavens, of the earth, this was the Quran. And this actually makes more sense that this would be something that God sent down, in a sense, because it's more coherent in the sense of like God already knew what was going to happen, so he planned it out. The idea of a prophet coming with like a book, a recitation or guidance from God, and he reads it one way and then somebody else reads it another way and another guy reads it another way, and this is all okay even though there is slight changes in meanings, it just seems like a very flawed way of doing things if this is truly from God. And now this is not a straw man, because this is what Sunni Islam is teaching. They're saying that there's allowed variants in the Quran, the 7 ahruf or the 7 ways, the 7 dialects or whatever. Yasir Qadi in a video actually said that the jumbled up mix of these 7 ahruf that were being read at the time of Muhammad is what we have today. We have a jumbled up mix of these different ahruf. So this is not something that I would see as a very competent God would be sending down. I mean, from my perspective, it doesn't make sense that God would do this. So I don't think it was a straw man, but I think you may be right.
My question to this, what's your basis? So let me challenge you on this. So whether you guys may claim to be atheists, but you are theologians in your own right. The argument you're giving me is a theological argument. It's not a historical argument. It's more like this is what God would do. So here's the thing. If you have to drive to a place that you've never driven to before today, would you rather have Google Maps, or would you rather have the MapQuest printout of the journey that your father took 10 years ago?
But isn't that what the Quran is? It was a Google Maps at the time of Muhammad. Now it's a MapQuest printout.
But here's the thing, right? At the time of Muhammad, right, a Google Maps type guidance is the most superior form of divine guidance.
Yeah, if it's divine guidance.
Because things are changing, and you would want a community that is guided by guidance that's responsive in real time is much better off than a community being guided by a static document. So
absolutely.
Under your model, if your model really holds, then what would happen is Muhammad would bring a book, and that one book, he would bring it at the beginning, like on the first day, and he would say to them, here's the book, all the guidance that you need forever is in this book.
Yeah.
Now, even if that book, let's say for argument's sake, it was like a 1,000,000-page book, and if you like you could theoretically, let's say theoretically there was instructions for everything. Let's just say, hypothetically.
Yeah.
This is now we're speaking as theologians here.
Yeah.
We're putting on our theology caps. There would still be a problem, and the problem would be because it's in book form. It can be interpreted by anybody and everybody, and even if you can guarantee an immaculate transmission of a physical book, you cannot make everybody's intellect immaculate, like uncorruptible.
Yeah.
So if the book can't be physically corrupted, it can be what you call hermeneutically corrupted, intellectually corrupted by like people doing erroneous readings.
Yeah.
Now, Quran being oral, it didn't function like that. Why was it recited? Again, so like Muhammad recites a whole bunch of these Qurans, as you see here, and then they put it in surahs. And why are the surahs recited? The surahs are recited almost as a way of, not for like, they're not going to the surah for like, okay, well, something else happened today, so I want to know, I'm going to go back and check the back guidance. They're reciting the surah to relive. They're trying to just relive that revelatory event. Because if Muhammad is alive and something new happens, do you think people went to Muhammad and they said, look, like we're reading the Quran to find out what we should do next? Like, does it make sense to consult your past directions, like that don't pertain to like now where you need to go. No. So Muhammad would actually wait. He would sort of recite new recitations. So that model is the superior model to sending down books any day.
I agree with you.
Debate
Yeah.
I think one can have is, after Muhammad, is it a good model to rely on a book? Is it a good idea to compile the Qurans into a single book? And I think the picture that emerges from the Sunni tradition is, in the absence of somebody like Muhammad, this is the best thing that could be done. So it was done. It's almost like this is like a fallback plan of sorts.
I agree with you, actually. I guess I misspoke in a sense when I said God should send a book, because I actually think that sending a book doesn't make a lot of sense, because, like you said, it's stuck in time. It's I mean, what could you put in that book that would help people forever and ever if it had to be one-time thing? And, you know, when I look at some of the Buddhist principles of Buddhism, I mean, for example, like hurt nobody, you know, stuff like that. I mean, I feel like these are good, like, general kind of principles, some of them, maybe not all of them, but like to have like a specific book that says this is how your inheritance should be, like, it's immediately outdated, right? Like, you know, in my industry, in software development, like, books are outdated like the minute they're printed. It's like, well, 1 month later you can't use that book anymore. But this book, it's like, we're talking about 1400 years later, and it has rules of inheritance, rules on divorce. Like, some of these things don't even make sense anymore. Like a daughter getting half of what the son would get. It makes no sense in today's world and in this society that I live in. So I agree with you that a book in general makes no sense. A living guide makes a lot more sense if they are truly being guided by God, or God could just speak to everybody directly, like, you know what I mean? Or the whole test of life it doesn't make sense, in my opinion, right?
No, I mean, that's a meta question. There's a meta question of sort of like, well, I mean, the question is meaningless if one doesn't believe that God exists. It's sort of like a moot point, the whole thing. But if one did, or if in your case, you guys seem to theoretically entertain the possibility of God for hypothetical purposes, for intellectual purposes. But I still think that when you do that, you have not really, I believe anyway, you guys don't really flesh out your, like, what is the nature of this God? Because truth be told, among Muslims themselves, there's no agreement on even what the nature of God is. There's agreement that there's one God, but there's massive debates about, like, the nature of God, God's attributes. What are God's attributes? Are the attributes eternal, or are they temporal? How does God act in the world? Like, this is a big question. So I think that when we make statements of, well, I think the whole thing, whatever, like, whoever, for people who do believe in the Quran, it can be part of, like, this full theological vision. And people today who are not trained either in academia or in theology, it becomes difficult to see that vision. Believers in a community, they often are only taught one part of that theological picture, right? I.e. the Quran part of it, for example, or the Hadith part, and they're not taught, like, the full part of it. You will find in Sunni Islam and in Shia Islam much more sophisticated accounts of this, exactly what you're talking about. Like, well, what is God? Like, how should God guide us? How do we know whether such a thing could even be? Like, these points are argued in theological manuals. They are addressed, but it's not accessible to most people today.
So before we finish, I definitely want to cover one more thing, which is there's a couple more things, but I definitely want to tackle it today if we have time, which is the idea of many Islams. You know, everyone today talks about Islam as one entity, one religion, one ideology, religious ideology. What do you think about that? Because I actually have a big problem with this, believe it or not. I don't think this makes sense. What do you think about this?
So I think that there's a big problem with the way everybody talks about Islam. And the problem begins because we use this singular Islam. I hear so many statements like, Islam says this, and Islam says, Islam believes. And it's just ridiculous, like, the level that you hear this.
Like, Islam says you have to kill apostates, for example, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
We
That's
hear
why.
this all the time. Right?
Yeah.
You hear it in the news, or Islam believes that women have to cover. Islam believes that women. Usually, what ends up happening is this: people pick out one objectionable ruling or practice or verse or whatever, and then they just put the word Islam in front of it. So suddenly, Islam, which is actually not one thing, but many different internally diverse traditions that don't remain the same, but they are evolving throughout history. So Islam suddenly gets reduced to one thing, and then that one Islam gets reduced to the thing they find objectionable. So for
Yeah.
example, one fiqh ruling, like a fiqh ruling from one book, like Reliance on the Traveler, which is from, I think, the 14th century. I don't remember the exact time, but like Reliance on the Traveler is like one Shafi fiqh book written by one scholar in the Shafi tradition, which is one madhab among, let's say, 8 madhabs. Somehow Islam becomes equated to that one ruling, right?
Yeah.
So this is a problem. It's a huge problem. And I think the first step is we need to now admit to ourselves that there are multiple Muslim communities, and I've tried to like put some names here. And amidst multiple Muslim communities, you have diversity of legal schools, what they call the madhab or the madahib. We can talk about more than 4. So the Sunnis, beginning in the 13th century, started to recognize 4 madhabs as equally legitimate. Prior to that, it was actually the Mamluk Sultan who sort of forced this reconciliation. But prior to like the 13th century, members of different Sunni madhabs in Baghdad are fighting one another intellectually and physically. Like they come to blows. Shafis and Hanbalis are fighting in like the streets of Baghdad and throwing rocks at each other, and you know, inter madhab fighting. This is happening. So like you have different members of different madhabs on different bases declaring each other as heretics. So finally, though, the idea of 4 madhabs, Sunni in the Sunni tradition, and the whole Sunni tradition as a whole is really like a project of reconciling theological schools and legal schools and Sufi orientations that are different, but it's sort of like putting it together. It's a project of slowly over time reconciling and recognizing. So that's one kind of diversity, madhab diversity. And today we can talk about 8 madhabs. And then if you count like I don't know whether you count the Salafis as a separate one or not, and you can count if you count the Quranists, if you have the Ahmadis. I know Pakistan doesn't recognize them, but you know that's really a political issue in Pakistan. The Ahmadis claim to be Muslims, so empirically and analytically they are Muslims as far as I'm concerned. And then you have modernists and progressives and reformists. So you have all this, and then in the Shia you have internal diversity, and that's not really madhab based. It's more like imamat based. Which line of imams does a Shia follow? So you have all these different Shia communities, and people like the Druze eventually see themselves as a separate. At least some of the Druze do. And then while this is going on, so that this is inter madhab and inter Shia, you have different theological schools. Theological schools differ, so the madhabs differ on legal interpretation, right? They differ on what are the sources of fiqh, of jurisprudence, what are the methods of interpreting the sources, and so on. They differ, and they come up with different rulings. That's madhab diversity. The madhabs evolved in history, as everybody knows. They started as regional, and then they became attached to a person, and then they each sprouted out to span many scholars. But theological schools, what are called, what is known as Kalam tradition, Falsafa tradition, and various mystical traditions, the Ismaili tradition, these differences are not about law per se, but about what is the nature of God. What is the nature of the cosmos? Like, what's the hierarchy like of God creating things? You know, do immaterial souls exist? Do we incorporate like the truths of Greek philosophy or not? So that all is theological diversity. So you could have 2 people of the same madhab, but one of them is a a Maturidi in their theology, and the other one could be an Ash'ari in their theology. Like you could have that.
And they're both Muslims,
So
yeah.
that's another type of diversity. And so that's your theology, right? So a lot of this issue of, well, what is revelation and what is God and what is God's speech and how does the Quran come about, that's treated more in theology than not treated in fiqh. And then finally, the last bit you see here are Sufi tariqas. So you can have a person who is member of the Maliki madhab who is also a member of, let's say, the Naqshbandi Sufi order. And they may theologically be a Maturidi. I mean, you can combine these. So you have all these Sufi tariqas, and I've listed a lot of them here, but still not exhaustive. The Sufi tariqas often tend to be concentrated by region. So certain ones will be in South Asia, certain ones will be in Indonesia, right? But that's how they'll tend to be. But you have them. And me and another scholar, we tried to estimate this at one point, but we estimated based on available info that today there's probably at least like 300 million Muslims who identify as Sufis of some sort.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean you're in a tariqa. Some people, they participate in the institutions of Sufism. They go to Sufi shrines regularly. They may not have a tariqa affiliation. So, to be part of a tariqa means you've given bayah, spiritual bayah, to a certain master. But you may not have done that, but you still participate in Sufi shrine culture. And I should add that according to Shahab Ahmed, from like the year 1000 to 1900, Sufism in this broad sense was the most popular form of lived Islam.
Yeah.
Because it was global. It wasn't just in one place. It was like you see this everywhere. So that's important to know. So Sufism did go under attack. The modernists attacked it. The Wahhabis attacked it. So it's taken a bit of a hit during the 20th century. But we're dealing with Sufism, major form of Islam. Now, the upshot of this is this. Each of these affiliations has a different vision of Islam. Each community, each madhab. Well, they're all defining true Islam in a different way from the next one.
Yeah.
And they're also giving priority to a different discourse. So some people, they define Islam legalistically. So like the genus of Islam, for example, they think Islam is really a law-based tradition. Other people think the genus of Islam is a theological tradition. So they're going to give more priority to kalam or falsafa or mystical theology. And others think Islam is a path of spirituality.
So, yeah.
So you have different Islams here. They all contradict one another. And how can we really talk about one?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you were saying earlier, you said you're an atheist and you're doing theology. I see this all the time. I find it kind of absurd when you have a non-Muslim that wants to insist that this is Islam and they have this one opinion they think is Islam. It's such a ridiculous thing. Like, for example, one of the stupidest things is Ahmadis are not Muslim. For example, why would you say that as a non-Muslim? It doesn't happen very often, but it's just such a dumb thing to even think, because obviously the Muslim, according to what they consider Islam based on the way they've interpreted Islam, but just to use them as an example, who is to say, why are they wrong and Sunnism is right? What makes them wrong and Sunnis right, for example? Or like you said, this particular ruling that some people get stuck on, or this book or this tafsir, it's just ridiculous, right? Because there's so much variety in Islam, and it's 1+ billion people in the world. You're gonna see a huge, there's obviously some things in common. All Muslims believe in Muhammad as a prophet, whatever that means. That might be different. Even that might be slightly different, but there's still obviously some commonalities. Just like in Christianity, there's commonalities across all of the different denominations. There's still Christians, but they would disagree on many things. And I think that's missed on large segments of the population, including many ex-Muslims. Many ex-Muslims actually insist that the worst interpretation of Islam that goes by that emphasizes hadith specifically, based on this Ibn Taymiyyah kind of, we didn't get to talk about this, but Ibn Taymiyyah, putting Ibn Taymiyyah's kind of interpretation of Islam at the top, and say, like basically what ISIS is doing, and saying this is Islam. It's unfortunate, and I'm glad we did get to actually talk about this a bit. There's more to be said, obviously, there, but we're running out of time now.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think that the problem, and people don't like the word, I think whether you like the word or not, Islamophobia is a real thing. Mm-hmm. And we can debate whether there's better words for it, but there's a real thing called Islamophobia, and it's not like I've heard a lot from the ex-Muslim circuit that look like we want to attack, we criticize Islam, but we love Muslims type thing. Or some people, that's fine. I mean, people can criticize anything they want, but you've also heard statements from ex-Muslims and others like Islam is an intolerant, violent, sometimes evil ideology. But we have no problem with Muslims. We love Muslims. Now, there's a huge problem with that whole statement, and I want to speak to it. Mm-hmm. But here's the issue. What ends up happening is people who say Islam is X, usually it's a negative X. So Islam is negative X, whatever you want to call it. We love Muslims. We stand up for Muslims, but we hate Islam. Here's what's happening. So the people who say this, what they're doing is they are literally abstracting, i.e. selecting certain traits from some forms of Islam, traits that they find objectionable. And what they end up doing is they equate Islam to those traits, pretty much. Mm-hmm. And it may be true that at somewhere, someplace, somebody does think of Islam in that way. Yeah. Okay? So there are Islams that are, harmful, you could say, that have caused damage to human beings. There are Islams like that. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to deny it.
Yeah.
There is that. This is true. There is a problem of, militancy and so on. Yep. You do have these. So you do have violent ideological constructs of Islam that are bad, mm-hmm. right? That result in death and stuff. The problem is this: most Muslims don't think of Islam in that way. Like the Islam that most Muslims think of in their head, that they believe they're practicing the right way, is a different Islam than the Islam of the militants. It's not the case that there's one Islam, the militants are just extreme about it, and everybody else is just lukewarm about it. That idea, which is what I'm hearing from a lot of people, that idea assumes there's one Islam and there's simply a sliding scale, and that one Islam inherently is evil. And it just happens that, 99% of Muslims, they don't take Islam seriously. That is completely wrong. What we're really looking at is there are ultimately, 1.5 billion Islams. And a cluster of those are violent, very small. 0.01% of them actually result in violence. And the rest of them, they don't result in violence. And one can debate about particular traits, rulings from some of these Islams. You can legitimately critique that. But the moment anyone says, well, I think Islam is X, and that includes for Islam as a peaceful religion, like it includes these generalizations. The moment anyone generalizes about Islam as a whole, it becomes very problematic. And at the end of the day, like the people who are arguing are not arguing about the same thing.
Yeah,
we need to say, okay, I'm talking about this Islam, this madhab, possibly this scholar. So if you quote Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Kathir, frankly, you haven't told me what the Quran means. You've just told me what Ibn Kathir and Ibn Taymiyyah believe. And, we can't take Ibn Taymiyyah. Some people are fans of him, but, either way, even if you love this guy, Ibn Taymiyyah's opinions are not equated to Islam or the Quran. If you want to know what the Quran means, read the Quran critically as a 7th century discourse. Don't read it through Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Kathir. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a lot of his work from prison. Yeah. Ibn Taymiyyah came from a town that was destroyed by the Mongols, and when he was in Damascus, the Mongols occupied Damascus. So Ibn Taymiyyah is an individual who is, to put it bluntly, he probably has some PTSD himself, like anybody who's like seen war. Ibn Taymiyyah was deemed by many of his contemporary Sunnis as a heretic, and he was tried for blasphemy and heresy. Like Ibn Taymiyyah believed that God has like a body, and he literally sits on a throne, and he's like literally in the sky, and so on. And he was taken to task for this. So just be careful, like whoever you are. Like you can't just be like, well, Ibn Taymiyyah this. Ibn Taymiyyah didn't have influence on the broader Muslim world until like starting in the 19th century, because the Wahhabi movement selectively appropriates Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas.
Yeah.
They don't all of it. So Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, he objected against certain Sufi practices, but he didn't think Sufism as a whole was wrong, right? Unlike, what some of the Wahhabi movement says. So Ibn Taymiyyah's influence today is sort of very overstated, because the Wahhabi movement has propped him up, and you would think now he's the most influential person, but this is an artificial image that has been concocted only recently. And if I ever showed you, you know what, I can even show you. I'm gonna put this on the screen. So what you're gonna get on the other screen here, I'm just trying to see if I can move it.
So while you're doing that, I'm just going to comment. I'm just going to say something based on what the comments I'm seeing here. Khalil and I have been discussing. We've been, like, let's say friends. I would say friends for a few years now. We weren't always friends during those few years. I've grown a lot in the way that I speak, in the way that I write. Sometimes I see some of the things I used to write, and I'm like, I shudder. And I think there's still things on my blog that Khalil shudders when he reads. So he doesn't agree with everything I'm saying. A lot of people, I just want to say this. The point of this discussion was not to debate Islam, was not to challenge Khalil on his belief, because he has a reason why he believes in Islam, why he thinks God exists. And I specifically said I don't want to talk about why God exists. I don't want to talk about Ismailism today, and I don't want to talk about why Islam is true. We can have that discussion, and we will have that discussion at one point, but that's not the point of the discussion today. Today we were kind of going through some of the things where I think we will actually not disagree. Even though he's a believer in Islam and I'm not, I actually think there's a lot of things that we actually agree on, which sounds crazy, but that's the fact. Especially being an academic, I think there's a lot more that we agree on, rather than if he was just like a dogmatic lay person, let's just say, right? So, but that's not the point of this discussion. So people will keep saying, oh, this and that, why does Khalil believe? I even had one guy email me during the live chat saying, ask Khalil to talk about how he believes. I'm like, okay, we'll talk about it next time, but I didn't miss your comments. We don't have time today. We've already gone like almost 2 hours now, so we're going to wrap it up. But just keep we'll get to that topic at some point, maybe in the next conversation that we have. So yeah, please go ahead.
So I have this on. So this is from there's an academic book, an edited book, i.e. meaning like different authors write different chapters on Ibn Taymiyyah. So there's this book, and this is a chapter from the book, okay? So this is actually what, like, one of my professors wrote this, and it was like, we had to read this for class. So what you have here in this block quote is, this is a fatwa, a legal opinion from the Sunni Shafi jurist Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. Okay, he died in 1556. So Ibn Hajar al-Haytami is a major, Sunni figure. He's seen in the Sunni tradition as orthodox. Now, he, lived in Mecca and all this stuff, right? Major figure. Here's what he writes about Ibn Taymiyyah. And this is I have nothing personal against Ibn Taymiyyah. This is for academically, historically, we need to know, how was Ibn Taymiyyah regarded, within his lifetime and few centuries later.
And just to add a little bit more, Ibn Taymiyyah is one of, you can say in a sense, a brainchild, not even a brainchild, but Ibn Taymiyyah is a major influence on ISIS. ISIS takes a lot from him, and a lot of the Salafi movement. So people might not realize why we're talking about Ibn Taymiyyah. Who is Ibn Taymiyyah? Ibn Taymiyyah is one of the influences behind, you can say, Salafism, and eventually a lot of these kind of terrorist movements, you could say, by extension. But please go ahead.
So here's what he says. Ibn Hajar says, I'll read it. Ibn Taymiyyah is a servant whom God has forsaken, led astray, made blind and deaf, and degraded. Such is the explicit statement of the leading scholars who have exposed the rottenness of his ways and the errors of his judgments. And then he goes on to refer to like other Sunni scholars, Subki and his son, and Ibn Jama'ah, who's also a major Sunni figure whose works I've read. And he goes on to say that like Ibn Taymiyyah, like, not only did he object to certain Sufis, like he criticized great Sufis, like he even criticized Umar and Ali ibn Abi Talib and so on. So he says his words are not to be taken seriously, but should be tossed aside, and it should be believed that he's a wayward innovator, an ignorant and extremist deceiver, and so on. So look, like, this is how Ibn Taymiyyah is regarded among his contemporaries, and obviously there's some hyperbole here, but it's just a fact that we should know that people, this scholar who has been selectively appropriated by the Wahhabis and Salafi movements and other groups, he's cherry-picked by them, because Ibn Taymiyyah himself wouldn't go as far as some of these groups have done. But in either case, Ibn Taymiyyah is not well regarded.
And ISIS actually quotes Ibn Taymiyyah for why they burn with fire, like, because there's a hadith that says, we don't burn people with fire, only God can do that. But they actually quote Ibn Taymiyyah saying that as an act of retribution, because they bombed us, we can use fire to burn. So they're actually quoting Ibn Taymiyyah. ISIS is quoting Ibn Taymiyyah. He's a popular medieval jurist. I know Yasir Qadhi is a big fan of him, if I remember correctly. So Salafis love him in general. I mean, but this is what the point of pointing this out, guys, is just to show you that even among Muslims, like, there's so much differences. That you can't just say there's one Islam, because there's not. And if you do that, you're making a fatal flaw. So Khalil, anything else you want to add before we wrap up? And once we wrap up, I want you to just share where you'd like people to find you. Someone was asking in the chat, like, do you have, like, I shared your Twitter, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to share, maybe YouTube or something else as well.
I mean, you could, if you want to find me, just Google my name. Everything will come up. Twitter, YouTube, whatever. I was wondering, did you want to take a few chat questions, i.e. relevant questions?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of questions that are like...
that are relevant.
Allah's a moon god. I see a lot of those.
So I saw one comment. Somebody said, "Oh, like Quran and Hadith and everything was written like hundreds of years after Muhammad."
Yeah, go ahead.
Quran. So the Quran, the text of the Quran, the official copy is written latest 650, like according to like most scholarly investigations. So we're talking about like, less than 20 years after Muhammad. That historically, that's considered very early. Right? Or like it's earlier than, say, like the Gospel of Mark or something. And that it's because of the early date of compilation that scholars can say, okay, the Quran does tell us about the historical Muhammad and, early Islam, whatever that means. That's why. So the transmission history of the Quran, the manuscript history, is very different from that of the Bible, right? The earliest New Testament manuscripts, I believe, are like 2nd century, like late 2nd century, and that's only a portion. You don't even have 1st century New Testament manuscripts, but you do have that in the case of the Quran. So you can't really compare the transmission of the texts of the New Testament and the Quran, because it's such a different history.
Do you want to talk, I mean, if like a very, very summarized answer to how you believe in Islam, despite like everything that you've said? Like very, very summarized.
I mean, look, all I would say is this: if you want to know my theological views, you're free to contact me offline through Twitter message or whatever, and we can have a conversation. And some people before, like when they heard about the event, they already have contacted me. So that's a discussion for a different day. It's not that I'm too afraid to talk about that. Rather, I'm here. I was asked to speak, and me and Abdullah agreed that this would be an academic discussion. It's not a theological discussion.
Although
There's different forums.
Yeah, we did kind of get into that by mistake, but yeah, for a bit. Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to talk about the moon god thing? Honestly, I find that so funny when I hear that, like Allah is a moon god, and the crescents on the mosques are showing moon.
Look, without detail, here's the problem with that. Why do the Christian Arabs pray to Allah if Allah is a moon?
Yeah,
what do they do?
Christian Bible says Allah in it, right?
Yeah, and the prayers say Allah, and we have Christian texts from like the Abbasid period. They still call God Allah.
Yeah.
What's going on with that? If he's just a moon god, I mean, this is a ridiculous question. I don't even know why.
You know where this comes from? This comes from Robert Morley. I think he's a Christian apologist, I guess, that wrote a book saying Allah, the moon god, and to be honest, the book was completely debunked by Shabir Ali. I'm sorry to say, Shabir Ali destroyed this guy's book. So I don't know why people keep saying this. It's so garbage. Even if, like, okay, miss, I don't even want to get into this. It's just question to Khalil. What are some of your favorite medieval Islamic scholars that'd be a good counterweight to ISIS? Oh, good question. Thank you, A. Aziz.
So this is interesting, right? Medieval Islam. So here's the thing. You don't even need to go to medieval Islamic scholars. There's a Syrian scholar, I think his name is Yaqubi. He has published in translation a whole book called A Refutation of ISIS. And I think he's Iraqi or he's Syrian. He's from the Middle East. And if you just type in Amazon A Refutation of ISIS, Yaqubi, you'll find this book. So there's also a scholarly book by a professor of Islamic Studies from University of Michigan, Muhammad Ali Khalil, his last name is my first name, called, I think it's called something like Islam, Jihad, Atheism. And that book, it gives you an entire history of how do Muslim sources from the Quran, the Hadith, the fiqh, i.e. the tradition of Sharia interpretation, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the new atheists, how do they all interpret warfare in the context of Islam? So this is by Muhammad Hassan Khalil. And the funniest part of the book is he concludes, as a scholar, that of all these different sources, Quran, Hadith, Sharia, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the new atheists, the people, the source that has the most permissive sense of violence are the new atheists.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
He says the new atheists imagine Islam to be even more violent than what ISIS and Al-Qaeda say is allowed.
It's a good thing they don't listen to us.
Yeah. So, you can check that out, and you'll find enough material in these things.
Yeah. What's the earliest uncontested complete manuscripts? I don't know. Do you know the Birmingham one? I think, right? But I don't know if it's complete or not.
I think now the Birmingham is the earliest.
Yeah.
Sana'a is some of the Sana'a is very early too. So I think it would be those two. But Islamic Awareness, they have a great chart which lists all the first century manuscripts, and it tells you how much of the Quran is in there by percentage wise. So what you end up getting is the first century manuscripts when you put them all together. So this is all within 100 years. When you put them all together, they give you something like 96%.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's a very good. Now relative to manuscripts of any other text, that is a very, very good manuscript record to have. It's unusually good. You don't have. Think about it, this is not just we have a manuscript. These are from the first century. Again, the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament are from the 2nd century, or
Are
I
these
think recently.
Are these full manuscripts? The Birmingham and
No, no. So as far as I know, that they're not full.
the Sana
I
is
don't
just
think so.
scraps of paper, isn't it? Like a few scraps.
The Sanad was a lot, though, right? Like it wasn't full, but there was like there were a number of
Oh,
surahs.
okay.
So you'll find Islamic Awareness gives you a table. So
Oh, okay.
basically, first-century manuscript record, if I recall correctly, it gives you 96% of the Uthmanic text.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a guy on Twitter, like you can ask him. His handle is PhDX, and Dr. Van Putten
Ah,
from
yes, yeah.
the Netherlands, and he would know this answer. So I don't work on manuscripts, and I'm just sort of, I can just refer you to things, but I can't really speak from firsthand experience.
Okay, so this was just want to say thank you. This was a great conversation. I think we covered a lot. Well, we didn't cover everything we were planning to, but we did cover a lot. And thanks, guys, for watching and for the questions. Yeah, sorry, there's no time now to get into more questions. It is pretty late now, so we'll have to do another one at some point. And I think the next one we do, maybe we can talk about some of the things you wanted to talk about that I didn't want to talk about. For example, what you believe about God, why God? Because obviously I'm atheist, you're a believer. So that's one thing. And also we can go into Ismailism. We can talk about Ismailism. We can talk about, there's a bunch of stuff we have. So would you like to add any concluding remarks, Khalil?
No, I mean, I want to say thank you to you and for those who tuned in. My only sort of concluding remark would be, I may be in academia, but like the more I read, the more you realize that most of the available sources on historical Islam, if we have it, we haven't read it. And if we don't have it, like there's more that has not even been there's more that hasn't even been cataloged.
Oh, wow.
So whoever you are, you may have read X amount of Islam. We have to keep in mind that there's more about Islam that we have not investigated than what we know.
Mm-hmm.
So we should always keep our conclusions provisional, because some new evidence, you may read a book tomorrow and it changes the whole thing. You may read somebody's dissertation and it changes your whole thing.
Yeah.
So we should be humble in sort of what we think Islam is, and we haven't figured it all out.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely books, like good example that comes to mind was I think Sir Wallace Budge and his translations of the Syriac Alexander romance and some of the insights that brought about into academia and the connection with the Quran. So I absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so that's a wrap then. Thank you, everyone. Sorry we didn't get to do more questions. And yeah, I think, you know what? Let's do the next one and we'll get into the nitty gritty of what people are asking, like why Islam? Why do you believe in Islam? Why are you a Muslim? And stuff like that. I think we can get into that next time. It'll be a hot discussion. Thank you, Khalil. And if you guys want to check out Khalil on Twitter, or anywhere else, you could just Google him. It's just Khalil Andani, at Khalil Andani on Twitter, and he has a YouTube channel as well, where he goes through some of his presentations he gave on what is more about the topic of the revelation of the Quran and the different contexts and I don't know what else you did, but there's a bunch of stuff on your YouTube channel as well. So do check him out and keep learning. And thanks everyone. Have a good night if it's nighttime, or good morning, I guess. Take care. Bye, everyone.